afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We're gathered here to talk about the Global Gateway and how it can reshape development partnerships between Europe and Africa. I'm going to try and be extremely short in my introduction because we have a super able and capable panel here, and I have loads of questions for them. But just to set the scene, I would say that the current geopolitical context, we all know, is mired by lots of uncertainty and lots of volatility. And that's really impacting development in the way that it can actually undo some of the outcomes which have been hard earned, albeit fragile, over the last decade. They can actually undo these developments, what has been achieved. And they have also affected how we think about development in general and financing for it. There's a lot of talk, as we saw this morning as well, about geostrategic interests, self-interest coming in when we talk about development elsewhere. And with that in mind, you also have the Global Gateway, where the idea is it's a development program, but with this geostrategic agenda in mind. But while we're talking about how the Global Gateway can actually assist African countries achieve independence, development, we also need to understand a bit what African countries need in the first place. And for that, rather than talking only about Africa, it also helps to take a step back. And if we're talking about financing, think about the Sevilla Commitment. This is an intergovernmental agreement between parties, between countries, to try and bridge the financing gap for sustainable development, not just in Africa, but all over the world. And that financing gap stands at $4 trillion. It might sound like an insanely big number, but actually, if you look at what happened during COVID and how much money countries actually managed to cough up in order to have response to COVID, it was $17 trillion. So $4 trillion by that comparison is very much achievable. So the question is, do we have the willingness on both sides to actually try and do something about it? So the problem is 4 trillion. Within that, you have Africa with its own financing needs, and then you have the Global Gateway. And we're gathered here today to try and see how we can bring it all together. So with that, I have a super interesting panel, starting with Mario Pezzini, who is former director of the OECD Development Center and a UNESCO Special Advisor. I have Marit Mai, so 2 seats next to him, who is MEP of the S&D Group, so of the European Parliament. I have Hermine Sam, who is Program Coordinator at the German Marshall Fund. And I have Oscar Ernero as well, who is Secretary General of the Olaf Palme International Center. So I have 2 panels, 2 rounds of questions. One trying to get at what do we need, and a second round asking how do we get to what we need. So starting maybe with you, Oscar. So the Global Gateway has overseas development assistance as part of it. And you have the Sevilla, maybe I should have mentioned this during my introduction as well. The Sevilla Commitment actually talks about 3 things that are needed. One is domestic resource mobilization through taxation. Secondly, addressing the debt crisis that is in many countries. And thirdly, do something about the reform of the international financial architecture. So if we look at the first component, which is about domestic resource mobilization, which is about taxation, and try to bring in ODA with taxation, in many African countries, ODA actually makes a big part of their budget. But that ODA doesn't really pay any taxes in these countries. So how would you think that ODA should be treated in these countries, especially when we're talking about the fact that ODA anyway is going down for many of these countries, and there's not that many avenues where they can generate taxes? Do you think it's a constructive argument to try and talk about taxing the aid money that's coming in, or should it be treated separately? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. First of all, yes, you're right. The ODA is going down. We can see it everywhere from Trump, but also the European countries and the organization I self represent. We have huge cuts coming. And I think the traditional way is to see and look at the ODA to be exempted from tax because you believe that every krona or dollar should do the most efficient. I think we need to look at this and maybe have some changes in that. I think first of all, I think it's important you make a difference between humanitarian support and the ODA support. When it comes to this humanitarian support, which comes to crisis and so, I still think it's important that that is exempted from tax because there you need to have all the money in place for that crisis. When it comes to the other part, this is money that goes into financial systems, and but to make that work properly, you almost when you talk about tax in Sweden, I will hold the tax authority accountable, and the tax authority will hold me accountable. So when we are paying out money, we will also have them accountable. Where is the money going? So we need to have like a dual communication here, which I think must be invented and much more strongly. I think this must be a joint, strong thing you do together, both receiving and sending countries. And then we have a lot of economies, or developing economies, where we have challenges with corruption, with primitive and naive systems that are not working really. And at the same time, you have foreign investments, foreign companies coming in, which then might have tax exemptions. They can be in export processing zones. So suddenly you have ODA money with no tax. You have domestic business with tax, and you have exporting zones with maybe no tax and not either social rights, no workers' rights, no nothing in those. So suddenly you have a very difficult components that you need to find and manage. So my answer to that question is it's not very easy. So I think we need to look at ODAs, for instance, that have ODA money that maybe in the first phase is tax exempted to make business grow in a leveled way with domestic business, but then phase it out so that it will, at the same time as you work with the tax authority in the receiving country, with the administration, so you have the infrastructure and the institutions in place that actually can work with that. So it's not really an easy yes or no question, but this is, I think, as a start.
Yeah. That's actually great. Thanks a lot for that. So I mean, what I take from you is that it depends on the social contract that you have between the governed and the governing, as we discussed in an earlier panel today. But also, it needs to be accompanied by certain kinds of reforms to actually make sure that institutions also know how they should be taxing and then what they should be doing with the tax revenue that they're getting.
Exactly.
So, Majid, maybe coming to you. I mean, this was a bit indirectly related to what we talk about when we talk about the Global Gateway, fiscal reforms and everything. But another thing that the Global Gateway is trying to do is have loans, right? Because there's this investment agenda in mind as well. And those loans are going to create debt. And in many cases, also burden African countries with debt. The hope, obviously, is that it's not going to be undue debt and then it won't saddle them into unsustainable and odious debts, but it will be debt nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And the second component of the Sevilla Agreement also talks about addressing debt burdens faced by countries. So looking at the Global Gateway and trying to connect it with the Sevilla commitments, is there a way in which Global Gateway instruments can be adapted so that they don't raise unsustainable debt for African countries?
Yeah, well, let me first say that I think we need to look at Global Gateway and also realize that it is an instrument of official development assistance. whereas it is also phrased right now by the Commission as an instrument of investment. And I think we need to take that step back, because when it is paid with official development assistance, the first goal should be poverty alleviation. And if you see in which the way in which it is being organized right now, which means investment also in companies, loans in infrastructure, for infrastructure that facilitates maybe opening up areas for mining, for critical raw materials. All of this does not, of course, have a first goal which is poverty alleviation. And at the same time, it also supports European companies and European investors in those countries that they probably already want to invest in. So it works, I think, positively for those companies that work mainly in middle income countries already, whereas we, of course, need also these investments and make sure that poverty alleviation takes place in the areas where with the lowest income in the LDC country. So I think it's important that we take a step back and look at what Global Gateway is. And also, if we see what the Commission has said about Global Gateway, that it is to support this the European competitiveness, and that it is something that is also from our interest. I think it's good to have both interests, but we need to make sure that the interests are really from both sides and not just from our side. Now, also the European Commission in its new multi-annual financial framework has one pillar, which is Global Europe. And this pillar, Global Europe, now also talks about crisis and the debt crisis, but it actually talks about a payment crisis, which puts the responsibility with the one that needs to pay. Whereas, of course, we have to look at the structure, and rightfully you mentioned the Sevilla Agreement, where we want to look at the structure in which these debts take place. And if Global Gateway only, let's say, puts countries in more debt instead of making sure that there is a restructuring of debt, then, of course, this is not what these countries need, because we all know that there's a large number of countries where the government pays more in debt costs than they have for healthcare and for education for their own population. So if we want to really make sure that this is an instrument also for poverty alleviation, also for development, then we have to look at these structures as well.
Thanks. I mean, you raised the point about debt structuring as well. Indeed, like 3 in 5 Africans live in countries where their countries are actually paying more for debt services than they are for health and education. So clearly there's something to be done there, which kind of builds in quite nicely with the next question I have, which is for you, Mario. So if you take taxation and debt as 2 points, where African countries have been calling for certain reforms, and if I was to kind of frame the tensions between the two sides, Europe and Africa, what they are calling for, on the African side, they're calling for rules to be set in a multilateral setting in a way which has legally binding commitments, and for voting to be done in a way that majority is heard. Whereas Europe, along with others in the West, it's not just Europe, but also parties in the West, they want it in a much smaller setting, and they want much looser rules of engagement, and they want consensus-driven voting so that their voices are heard. But these become like fairly untenable situations, or maybe that's my question to you. Are they untenable, and how do we actually try to bridge these seemingly differing opinions?
Thank you for the question. Let me try to frame this discussion by recalling a series of points that have already been made, by the way, but I think they are helpful. What is the principal source of funding for policies in southern as well as in northern country? Taxes. Aid come much lower than taxes, and after taxes are remittances, which means that are African paying for their own development. And then you have foreign direct investment and ODA, more or less, at least you add foreign direct investment and ODA. Now, where do we stand with taxes in Africa? In general, in the developed countries, as we call them, let's say in the OECD country, a country pay in taxes 34.5% of their GDP. In Latin America is 22.2. In Africa is 17%. In Asia is more or less like in Africa. So you say it's very low. How can you finance either your debt or mainly your policy with this amount of resources? One may say it's impossible. Well, if we go inside this number, then we discover easily that in South Africa, the percentage of taxes on GDP is 29%. That in Tunisia, up to recently, it was 31%. That in the case of Morocco is 26, more than Chile, that is 24. Latin American, usually they don't realize these differences. But even in Latin America, it's the same. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay are around 30, whilst you have countries in Central America that are around 14. Even Mexico is around 15%. So why I am insisting and bothering you with this number? Because they show that even if the level is low, it's not necessarily low. There are countries in Africa that have been capable to modify their financial structure. And I think this should be a serious target. But how can we reach that target? I think there is a general principle that we discuss in these days in Europe, also when we discuss about the Zuckman proposal. We need some tax morale. You cannot go and ask a certain actor to pay if others that are much richer don't. In the case of Africa, there are crucial actors that needs to be taxed, like the multinational actors, because they produce in Africa, in part at least their production, but they don't pay there the taxes related to their production. Through complicated mechanisms, transfer prices mainly, the taxes are paid where it's more convenient for them, in particular where you don't pay that much, including in certain European countries, including this one, by the way. As a consequence, how can we make multinational pay? Here comes the debate that you recall. And let me tell you just a little story. I promise I will be very short. But in 2000, for many years, in OECD countries, the rich countries, including not Europe, but also North America, Japan, and South Korea, and Australia, the point was, why shouldn't we adjust the things and, for example, fight against the fiscal paradise? But there was always a series of countries blocking. Among others, not that much Europe, was the United States blocking all the time. But then comes the crisis of 2008. And all country needs fiscal revenue because they have to spend and they don't have fiscal revenue available. Including United States at this point, they are ready to go and fight fiscal paradise. And here comes the famous story, the older of you will remember the blacklist and the work in the OECD to do something that was the automatic exchange of information. When you open an account in another country, the other country has to inform your country that you have done so. And so you reduce the possibility to export. Starting from there, a work was developed also to tackle multinational. Was done in the OECD, which is the rich country, and as such, the criticism from the South, but in reality was done in a kind of different way. Was created a forum to which are there 148 countries, so many Africa, many Latin America, to decide what should be done against this practice of multinational to avoid paying taxes. 2 pillars were developed, they were approved, and they were going to be implemented. But Mr. Trump decided that he didn't want to stay in this agreement, and he stepped down. And unfortunately, the Prime Minister of Germany immediately said, but also the other pillar is now over. And so that agreement failed. Let's be clear. Now, should we continue to do it in the OECD? No. Why? It happened for a series of events, small events that I described to you. There is no theoretical reason why it should take place there. It's much more serious that you do it in a place where there are many countries. I wouldn't be critical anyhow of that experience because it was an icebreaker. By chance it happened, why don't we go? It was a possibilism. Today, if we have to think about those matters, where should we address them? And I conclude by saying, look, OECD is a metaphor of the way in which the North have tried to deal with development. It was created in 61 by the country of the Marshall Fund, so necessarily included Europe plus some North American. Little by little, it included other developed countries, Japan, Finland, and so on, and other. But the first country of the South entered only in 94, was Mexico. And why? Because those countries that were there from the beginning, in particular on the other side of the Atlantic, didn't want many other countries around the table. Want to discuss around the table, but not with many others. And therefore, the South didn't appear. Look at the country I'm talking about. From 61 to 94. These were the year of the decolonization, as if it didn't happen. It didn't enter in the door of these multilateral practices. It was kept outside, which means that the South doesn't have a voice in many occasions. And that's exactly what we need to take into account. The South, as we have heard from Anne, from many in the previous discussion, needs to co-design rules. But if you want them to co-design, they need to sit with the same voice at the same table.
Yeah. I mean, you raise an excellent point. I mean, the way I would see it as well is like that we shouldn't be engaging in multilateralism only because it's a good thing to do, but also be trying to find ways in which there's an urgency on both sides to be trying to address this question. And the point you raise about taxation and the role of the financial crisis is really an excellent one, which again builds to my question to you. I mean, we've been working for decades now on Europe-Africa relations and how to transform it from a donor-recipient kind of relationship to a partnership of equals. We're still getting there. But then one way to think about it, if you look at also what Mario was saying, would it help perhaps to make it not a partnership which can be vague and abstract, and rather focus on very topical or thematic issues, maybe talk about green or digital or health or security or some such. And if we had that one topic, you can create that sense of urgency and say, we need to sit around the table and we need to have our rules of engagement. Do you think that helps, or it needs to be in a broader Europe-Africa partnership setting?
I'd actually say that although it's completely logical to think that when you focus on one topic, you can bring up a quality, very, specific and quality approach to a partnership, I think that actually on the EU-African partnership, it's very important to look at it on the broad base. The challenges that we have been faced with in the recent years, for example, COVID, show that really you need to look at all of the various sectors that you were mentioning. Health sector, we needed to look at that, how who was manufacturing vaccines at that moment. You needed to think on how was the digital sector developed, and how was the energy sector also invested into. I remember clearly during COVID, the questions were a lot about who has access to computers and who can actually be able to create a semblance of work structures, and who was able to still follow, an education and at university, for example, or in various schools. So I think that it is important for us to look and keep a view on that broad-based approach relationship, because it does also speak to the complexity of the relationship between the African continent and the European continent. Currently, I don't think that the partnership that we are trying to build, that is one of equality, needs to really be just topical. It actually just needs a lot more proof of concept. We're talking a lot about this equality, and we want to build that. But when you look at, when the challenges are hit, like again, COVID, we see that we had missed the opportunity to actually build on the one thing that this partnership needs, it's trust in between these two partners. So I wouldn't think that we really need to think of one specific topic that we have to harp on, but just really, look at how we can develop it on more of a broader approach. And I mean, I think about it also on a different scale. It's when the European Union comes with the Global Gateway as a proposal, it really comes at it as, okay, this is how we, the European Union, are approaching you, Africa, with a better proposal than that of China, for example. That was really in the concept how it was developed. And here, what we need again in this in this idea of proving that the concept of partnership of equals is working, is that we should approach it with, again, this we as how can we, with the African Union, with Africa and various African actors, build an alternative model of partnership, one that is really built on mutual growth, on mutual learning, because that's maybe sometimes something that's missing. It's this idea that we are going to bring skills into Africa, but there are also a lot of various technology and skills that are on the African level, and that can be that Europe could benefit from. Again, on that green sector, there's a lot of questions around how Africans tackle architectural topics in countries where the climate question is actually a lot more present and strong in terms of reality. So the idea is really, how can we showcase that we're ready to really, again, build a common table where we look at not building that model on an extraction one or on power plays, but really on where is that mutual growth. So there's an intentionality that's missing maybe in the global gateway, where you see that on the African Union side, there is a lot that's already built in terms of strategies. You've got the Agenda 2063 that exists, and it's set on seven aspirations, all of which have goals that actually match a lot of the goals of the European Union in the sense that they could echo each other. The very first one being the very first goal of the very first aspiration being to pull the living standards of the African various citizens. And here the idea is, how can the global gateway bring that? And it's, again, when you look at these big projects that are being showcased, like the Lobito corridor, that's amazing, which is, again, a very much extractive model sort of thinking. The idea is, in that sort of framework, how can we bridge? Okay, sure, we're, again, constructing lines that are going to be opening ports and sending out critical raw material, but where is the intentional smaller scale products that can be, or projects that can actually bring more skills and growth on lower levels of civilians. I mean, in that a small example that I was thinking of, when you're creating roads and creating, again, these links around the Lobito corridor, an interesting project could be to include things like thinking of how can we build schools around or annex universities around, critical raw or mining in general, and link that project to the Lobito corridor. So yeah, intentionally thinking of various steps that can bring more benefits to African civilians in the end, and not just thinking in a sense of what are the benefits that European can get, but really, how can we build from those big mega projects also more sense and pull up the living standards of Africans.
Yeah. No, that's also very interesting, right? So the point is not about Europe doing some projects in Africa and on Africa, but also with Africa, is a bit what you're trying to say as well. That is kind of my first round of questions on what is needed. Now maybe I can move to how we get there. And for that, Mario, maybe I come to you. I mean, Hermine raised the question of China, and also Majid and Oscar, what they were saying, there was this underlying question about private sector development. And one of the things that the Global Gateway is trying to do is to engage its own private sector in order to do these projects. Could it be Lobito or something else? But you also see that the European private sector is famously lacking in Africa, right? Like you have, because of concerns around risks or because of business environment not being to their liking, etc. But then you have these Turkish, Chinese, Indians, name it, they are all there, basically. So my question to you would be, how can Europe do a better job of engaging its private sector, and how do we get rid of these perceptions that Africa is basically a problem to be solved or in need of help, rather than us also learning from them? Thanks.
I'm very sorry because I don't think I will answer exactly your question. But I would like to link it with what we were discussing up to now and to see how we have to act on what exists, the global gateway, independently from all the critiques that we have. We have that tool. What do we do at the best if we can? In this respect, let me just restart from what we were saying. For you to know, the committee that is supposed to manage the ODA is called Development Assistance Committee. It's based in the OECD and is not even composed by all the OECD countries. For example, Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, Turkey, and I can add other, are members of the OECD, but they are not in the committee dealing with aid, right? Of course, there are no recipients, only donors, right? That's the practice we have behind us. How can we continue in that way? We are obviously doing the opposite of what the African actors are repeatedly saying. We want to cooperate. You do not pretend to be exclusive because we can cooperate, we want, China and else. But you must be also inclusive and include the countries that are with us. There is a strong demand for voice, in other terms. And there are more and more institutions for that to happen. The Africa Union is something that doesn't have an equivalent in Latin America. You have maybe ASEAN that has something similar. So Africans are building their own institution. The African Union have been included under the presidency of the G20 done by India in the G20. Now is a permanent member. And there are many other instances in which Africa is speaking. Now, but are we sitting at the same table? Can we discuss together those things? I think that's a signal that Europe should send. Why? Because Africa has several needs. I will not repeat them, they are clear. But Europe has a lot of needs as well. And in the previous panel, recalled to us that Europe pretends to have a strategic autonomy. Of course, the other side of the Atlantic is kicking our ass every 2 days, using moreover those words. And therefore, what do? Do we go to ally with Russia? Is it possible? China is now depicted very often as the bad guy in the James Bond movie, is the Spectre, so we cannot deal with China. The other alliance, naturally, is America Latina, Africa, and some other Asian countries. What do we do in respect to them? How can we dialogue with them? Do we reproduce the same mechanism that we think, because it's not like that. I participate in many meetings of the One Belt One Road, that we pretend that China come there with the money and that's it. It's not exactly that way. But we, with the global gateway, in a certain sense, we do mimetism in a bad way, because we don't have the capacity of finance of China, among other things. So what should we do when we approach the developing countries? I think we should move from strategic autonomy to cooperation autonomy. We should establish as a strategy strong alliance, or at least strong strategic partnership with those actors. The first thing to do is to give them a voice, like the other. The global gateway, therefore, under my point of view, should be managed by a platform where sit together European country and some South country to discuss what to do. What are the rules for investments? What are the priorities? How the procedure should be conducted? If any, how the participation, including financial participation, can come from some southern country that could participate. Brazil, I don't know, others, right? Now, this table that we suggest in a paper that we prepare for the FEPS and we presented in Sevilla, this one, if you don't have a copy, I can sell you.
Sell, yeah.
He said sell,
He
right?
said sell. Yeah, we had it. Yeah.
Now, I'm joking. Obviously, it's from FEPS. No, but the point is very important. In other terms, Miss van der Leyen, the 17th of October, if I am not wrong, made an important intervention in the Gateway Forum, and she proposed a gateway hub. Great! I said, let's go and see. Maybe this is the place where the South and the North will discuss. And then I read what she said, and she's mentioning private European firm, European countries, European actors, and some stakeholders. Of course, you need to some stakeholders. That's exactly, under my point of view, the reproduction of a mechanism that we have systematically in mind. I will give you another example, and then I conclude. When we discuss about this problem of strategic alliances, and you follow the discussion, we Europeans, we tend to discuss how we will therefore strengthen our competitiveness. So we are talking about alliances with the South, and the focus is on our competitiveness. Mr. Draghi is called Mario, but I think you realize I'm not Mr. Draghi. Draghi recently in an intervention said the right thing. He said, the problem of our European was that we thought that the economy would have been the core. Once solved the economic problem, the rest would have followed. We failed. It was not only the economy. And then he spent the rest of his discussion about competitiveness. If the problem is not only the economy, what do we do in terms of international relations? This should be the focus of our discourse, and this should be the focus of a rethinking of the global gateway that should be transformed in a fund in which the North Europe and the South will participate, managed with a platform where there is both actor, and of course Europe should take into account also other revendication about debts and other aspects.
Yeah. I mean, I still maintain, you, as you said, you did not answer my question about private sector engagement, but you did have a very good answer, which I do think it gives very important points, right? Like, we need to be looking at African agency, or at least partners, if not just Africa, when you're talking about the global gateway. What do they want? What problem of theirs are we trying to resolve?
If you allow me, I would like to say the following thing. I personally don't think that in the present crisis of multilateralism, we can sit at the table and redesign the overall system.
No.
This was possible after the Second World War. Fortunately, we are not after a war. What can we do now? I think we can do experiments. In certain fields, when possible, we can recreate coalition of the willings and working on a team. I think that the global gateway, as taxes, and another example, could be one of those fields. That's it.
But I mean, in order to do that, you will need two to tango, right? So you need the African
more
side,
than two.
But also on the European side, then I think the point also would be that the European side also speaks in one voice and coherently. And maybe that's my question to you. I mean, Germany has the Compact for Africa. In Italy, you have the Mattei Plan. So all member states have their own strategies and philosophies in terms of how they want to deal or engage with Africa. And then you have the Global Gateway. And at least in my work, when I interview also different people, there's a lot of confusion on the other side in terms of, okay, what is what exactly, and who do we talk to when we have something to speak with the EU or any? So how do you think this can be resolved?
The confusion is actually not just on the African side. I think it's also, as policy analysts, it's really just confusing to look at all the summits that are popping up one after the other, from like France to Africa or Spain to Africa. And what's funny is that everyone brands it as we are the gateway to Africa. If you go on the Spain to Africa summit, the mention there is Spain is the gateway to Africa. Italy had the same thing. We are the gateway to Africa. And it's true that it does confuse, it does create a lot of commotion and a lot of confusion. It looks really messy in a sense. And in a way that we could actually look at how to build on that, I think that we should move past this because it looks like we're competing one with another to find influence in Africa. And there's a way in which the European Union, through instruments like the Global Gateway, can act as a compatibility sort of platform. But to do so, that's a question of maybe looking at how we can advance the private sector of each and every one of these member states, for example. We're talking about, before I was talking about how a broad-based approach is possible. Through the approach of Spain, through the approach of Italy, each of these countries cannot possibly be an answer to all of Africa's questions. That is actually something that's always been hammered back from the African stance, is you cannot talk about an Italy-Africa summit and have the Italian Prime Minister and then all of the other African states there. It has also in terms of image, a very hard symbolism in itself. But actually, the European Union can act as the 27 member states can actually touch upon that broad approach and bring, let's say, champions on specific sectors, like France's aerospace, Italy's energy leadership. The Netherlands can look at things like logistics, hubs and ports, and these are ways in which I think that the Global Gateway can really act to pull each of the member states' specificities and not necessarily work as a competitor, because right now it looks like the Global Gateway is in competition to each of these initiatives, but it's definitely not the case, and it can work as a centralizer. Another thing that's actually interesting is when you look at the approaches of each and every one of these member states, they're all looking at strengthening their own position internationally. They're looking at building up their economic partnerships through, the compact was very much bringing German businesses to African markets. The idea here, but when you look at, for example, with the Italian one, an additional point was made on addressing the migration problem that is very much a domestic issue in Italy, same thing for Spain. And that's actually interesting to look at how, as member states, they have very similar concerns, domestic concerns, as exist on the African continent. The question of migration is very much also one that is present inside of Africa. So there's an interesting parallelism to be made here as to how the member states can act as, continental coalitions to speak about one similar thematic issue. Basically. So, maybe one way of bettering it is to showcase the Global Gateway as more as a platform to, manage all of the various different strengths that the various member states have.
Yeah. I mean, this also goes into the whole Team Europe approach that they are increasingly trying to adopt in order to have this coherence as well.
Mm-hmm.
But then, Marit, maybe for you, I mean, there was on the 17th of October, there was the Global Gateway Forum. And interestingly, if you look at the presence of European member states and their heads of states, it has been shockingly low. So the EU is there, and the EU is desperately trying to say the hub is also going to be about European private sector and then some stakeholders. But you're not necessarily seeing a buy-in from member states. So how do you think that buy-in can be created? What needs to happen in order for Germany and France and Netherlands to think like, yes, Global Gateway and the Team Europe approach is how we should be going about it?
Yeah, well, the simple answer would be that countries should trust each other, that they also have this buy-in from their own perspective. But I think the more complex answer, and I like the way that you phrase it as concerns, is that many member states have their own obsessions. I think migration is a real obsession in many European countries. Sorry? In France, but also in this country. Let's not forget where we are sitting right now, and it's somehow it makes these conversation with the African continent on many other aspects, which we have talked about, and you mentioned it, Hermine, that we when we look at our collaboration, we often think that we will bring stuff because we can help. Which of course is not an equal partnership. If you have an equal partnership, you also recognize that the other side has things that are in there maybe you can learn from, not just extract, but also have a mutual beneficial relationship where both can profit. And I think this is something that in the current political context in the European Union, in our individual member states, is just not on the number 1, 2, 3, or 5 of the agenda. It's very low. In our member states, we're very inward looking. we're inward looking on security and all the other issues I think that we can think of. And international relations are, well, apart maybe from Trump, which is of course only maybe I think also for entertainment in our media, and China, but the rest of international relations is very low on our agenda. We simply do not seem to talk about it, which of course also then gives the input to politicians to not to talk about it so much. So if you want to have politicians, heads of state, also participate in these kind of fora, or for example next week in the AU-EU summit in Angola, it's going to be interesting to see how many prominent politicians from European countries are actually going to participate there, to showcase that they really want to have this connection with the continent as a group together. And we see that in some individual countries in the global south, the Team Europe approach works, often because there is a number of, I think, diplomats or countries that have similar interest, and they collaborate together. They really try to do projects together. But in many cases, it's also more of a, well, we sit together and we talk, but we don't really make 1 + 1 3, which is, of course, the idea behind the Team Europe approach, because you have the individual approaches still from member states, which I think is good that they still have their own individual approaches, but they should be aligned. They should not be competition. I remember still from years ago working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in the Netherlands that often there was a sense of competition between who was doing which project in countries. But we have to bring it together and make sure that we have these interests together, and not only from our side, but then also do go back to what we talked about before, also the interest of the partner country that we're working with. So there's these many levels of, I think, not prioritizing this relationship, which we should prioritize, that make it very difficult for a global gateway to really be this kind of collaborative instrument that we maybe want to have. Some sides might be good. I'm very critical of the way in which it functions right now, again, because I think it's official development assistance, which we should not give to companies that don't need these subsidies. But if we want to use it in the right way, we should really look at it collectively, and look at it collectively from the other side with our partner countries. Yeah. And also make sure that we have this interest. And right now, I think there's just these obsessions with national politics and with all. If I may tell you one small anecdote, we are working on Erasmus Plus. There's a number of African countries where Erasmus Plus is already partnering with. So there's students from those countries coming to Europe, and the other way around also. And we want to expand this. And there is like a real movement in the European Parliament against this. And we are wondering why, because we are always talking about we want to have legal pathways for migration. And we want to have collaboration in the academic field, in building knowledge together. One of the beautiful instruments that we have for young people, a legal pathway, both ways, to learn together, is this instrument. And then people that are preaching that we should do this in a legal way and we should stop the irregular migration are also the same ones that are stopping these instruments. So I think we should call them on their responsibility. If you want to move forward, put your money where your mouth is, and also make sure that if we want to have an equal partnership, if you want to apparently stop some things but want to facilitate it in the other way, do it. Yeah. And not stop it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a very good example, actually. I'm trying to think how I want to formulate my last question to you, Oscar, based on what was being said as well. I think there's an uphill battle here, but it's a battle worth pursuing, right? So we need, on the European side, we need to have everyone thinking, if not the same way, at least in a similar direction, so that we make some progress. And on the other side, we also need to be better able to listen to what our partners want, give them also some kind of agency. Again, I'm coming back to that word. But that would also mean ceding some kind of power, so that Europe is not the one making the rules and setting the rules of engagement to which Africans then have to dance the tunes. That is difficult to do, right? For various reasons. We have discussed some of them already. But maybe going back to Hermine's point about having some kind of proof of concept, do you see there's any avenues where this is happening, where there is that willingness to actually listen to the other side and then mutually learn something from it and do something together? Or do you think we're still far away from that stage?
Yes, it's of course
Very easy question, sorry.
$1 million question. You asked what can we do, and I think given what colleagues said, I think from the EU side to be a bit provocative, maybe it's not, but it's a lot of rhetoric, and the relation between EU and Africa is still very uneven. And it's coming from Sweden, for instance, just for an example, it's Sweden first. We talk about competitiveness. Yesterday, I raised the question of aid for trade, which is going like a thematic all over the world. It's almost always in the interest of in this case, of Sweden. How can we brand Sweden in different ways and I attended, for instance, a mining event in Zimbabwe, and it was almost sad to see because there were no infrastructure, there were no thinking behind it. They just drove down Swedish companies to sell their stuff. There was like nothing else there. And we have our politicians goes to Brussels and decide on this gateway and other nice things, and then they go home and do their own politics, like aid for trade, and putting it to migration, putting it on different ways. So I think there is an uneven relationship. I think we maybe not experiment, but I think we need to experiment, but we also need to rethink and reshape how we work. And I welcome that to have new forms of engaging platforms and so. But I think, and answering your question, is more on the local. How do we work on the local area? And I can see trends as well now that the big donors, big donor organizations have more difficulties to actually do local stuff. So I think NGOs working in the local community can be one answer for that. But at the basis is that we need to have an understanding between EU and Africa on those thematic that is both beneficial for both, to align on that. What is in it for us, what is in it for them. And for that we need to meet. And then of course we have some burning questions right now. It's of course peace and democracy. It's a digital revolution. It's the green transition. It's of course trade, industrialization, and other topics that I think if we get around the table to discuss them, we could do it both on national and in the local community. And so that's my answer. What we can do, we need to integrate with the local communities as at the same time as we reshape the structure of the institutions, and that is not so easily done, I guess.
No. Iteration is never easy, but at least it's worth doing, right? I am mindful of the clock. We have exactly 6 minutes. I'm sure there's loads of questions, but I'm also very proud I managed to finish with all of you in this amount of time.
Well done.
So, for anyone who has questions, please raise your hand. I see one over there at the back. Yeah, we'll go for maybe a round of maybe 3 questions.
Okay. Africa is in a poly crisis, and Africa needs poly solutions to lift it up. Mario said, what can we do? What can we do repeatedly? And Marie said, we have to engage in equal partnership. I give you 3 steps you can do. Number 1, Europe should cleanse itself completely of the colonial mentality, the neo-colonial mentality, the superior mentality, completely, and engage Africa on an equal basis. Number 2, European banks, European politicians, European policymakers know that trillions, if not billions, trillions of euros and dollars have been stolen from Africa and are stuck in their banks. Freeze that money. If you freeze Putin's money for invading Ukraine, freeze it and tell the governments until and unless you do something positive for Africa, you won't get the money back. Number 3, Mary said, Europeans are looking inwards. Africa should do that. Look inwards. Work together. South Africa is very good. Botswana is very good. Nigeria is very good. Senegal is very good. We have everything we need. All we need is that inward cohesion. Work together. Forget about Europe for the moment. Forget about America for the moment. Work together. The education is there. The labs are there. The only thing we need is access to energy so that we work together. That's my 3 steps for you.
Perfect 3 steps. One more here. It was a comment.
Hi. I have a question about African diaspora. I work with the African diaspora a lot, and I promote them, make them visible. So how do they come in this picture? How do you work with them, and do they have a voice because they know both worlds?
I believe Sandra there had a question. One more. Yeah. There was someone there who had raised their hand, but now I don't see them anymore.
Hi. I have a couple of questions. First is around Africa being an equal partner, and this is more of like potentially a devil's advocate question. To be an equal partner, you have to have power, you have to have leverage, and arguably because of weak institutions, weak states, we could make the case that Africa is not in a position to be an equal partner. What does leverage look like for Africa, and how does it get to that point of becoming an equal partner? And then my second question is around how the EU engages with Africa generally. And in the context of debt more specifically, what is the EU doing about reducing African debt? And more specifically, what is it doing about the perception of risks of doing business on the continent? Because we understand that the perceptions of risk are actually higher than what is realistic on the continent. So how is the EU engaging with that particular problem?
Thank you. And then we have Christopher. Yeah.
You have to.
And then we wrap up.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you all for your interventions. I'll make my question very quick. There's this apocryphal statement attributed to Henry Kissinger, who said, allegedly, who do I call if I want to speak to Europe? So I think about the fact that in the last decade, there's been the G20 Compact with Africa. There's been the Matei Plan, the Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment. Now there's the Global Gateway. Who does Africa call? Who does when it wants to speak to Europe?
Good question.
I will leave it to the panelists. Take a pick. What do you want to go? You were nodding your head very much when the question about diaspora was asked. So go ahead.
Perfect question, because actually also I was sort of preparing my end point, which was my final point on this on diaspora engagement. Actually, there is a organic gateway. It was something that we were talking about yesterday that is not at all leveraged by the European Union, and I don't know if it's in line with the lack of wanting to recognize the historical weight between this relationship, but there are Africans that exist in Europe also already. I mean, yeah, look at that shock. We were talking, I should have said that I was Swedish, sorry. But there is this engagement that already exists in terms of not just sending money, because we're talking about remittances, and I think that the number in 2022 was more or less equal to ODA that was received.
Up for us.
We're done, but I'm...
It'll be very quick.
Yeah. And it's not just money. We're not just sending back money. We're also building skills. There's enormous amounts of initiatives that are being set up by diaspora groups that are looking to teach coding, because there's a lot of diaspora in coding. It's things like cousins that are looking to go back to Africa and to become teachers and to become university professors. So there's really this humongous network that already exists that is talking on multiple levels, questions of identity, questions of culture, questions of economics that actually can be leveraged. And yes, that's a question that I would turn to European representatives, which is also, is there an engagement that has been sort of thought about and structured in a way that we can really leverage the the powerful connection that we already have inside of Europe, in a sense. And yeah, it was
Very briefly. We are 1 minute over. but
Okay,
thank
try
you
to
very
do
much.
it in 1 minute, which I can't. I think part of answering your question, also the question about diaspora, is looking at civil society and at civil society organizations and those connections. And they are there. I think in the past we've worked more with diaspora organizations, at least here in the Netherlands. But this all has been sort of watered away, and it has watered down. And if you look at all the pressure that is taking place right now on civil society organizations, be it here in Europe, but also be it in the global South, I think it's really important that we try to make sure that we support civil society and we support that voice, because it's an important voice for all the reasons that you said, Hermine. There's one more thing I want to say about the perception of Africa. We still think that it's 1984, and that it's, if you look at the way that Africa is portrayed mostly in our newspapers, right now we have the Sudan in the newspapers. And this is what we see. We think, I know some people have said that Bono was the worst thing that ever happened to Africa. Because this is the perception that we have still of Africa, especially my generation. The only thing we know is that there is a constant, famine and chaos and corruption and wars, where there is so much more, which of course also brings, like you say, the perception of businesses, which is often a very wrong perception. There's many countries, African countries, where you can do perfectly well your trading and your other business with, but people just simply think it's too dangerous, and they don't know. And I think there's really, it's a challenge. Maybe we can go back to the diaspora to help us to improve that image, to make sure that what we think of the continent in Africa and of African countries is actually what is going on there. Yeah. Good. Thank
Exactly,
you.
and doing it.
Okay.
On that
2
happy
minutes.
note, unless someone wanted to come in.
Fine.
Only to say that I don't buy the argument about the lack of capacity of an actor in Africa to represent the Africa, or of Europe that doesn't have only one voice, therefore it cannot work with the developing countries. Sorry, but go back to history. When Europe was created, how many voices were there? Of course, these are things that you build over time. Africa has many voices as well. Can you say that Morocco speaks the same voice of South Africa or Egypt? Of course not.
yeah.
The only way to come to those type of results is to start talking to each other,
Yeah.
instead of expecting that the other is mature to speak to you. That's it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.